Yeah, absolutely. So this is the research of Stefan Lindberg, who was a researcher at the University of Lund in Sweden, and he was a guy who was really inspired by some of the original um, grandfathers of the paleo movement, like Boyd Eaton and Melvin Konner. And so a lot of the people in the paleo movement, um, there are very few people who, a lot of people talk about non-industrial cultures, but there are very few people who have actually gone out and studied non-industrial cultures
Yep.
in that community. And he's one of the few people who has actually gone out and done it. So he was so inspired by this stuff that he decided that he was going to go study this culture that had scarcely been touched by industrialization. And they weren't actually hunter-gatherers. So Stefan was really interested in the paleo diet. These people were not actually hunter-gatherers, but they did eat in a manner that was kind of broadly consistent with our conception, with the common conception of the paleo diet, which is to say that they didn't eat grains, they didn't eat dairy, they didn't eat processed foods, they didn't eat any kind of agricultural foods, beans. Actually, they ate very little of it. Let's put it that way. And so yeah, he went to this island Catawba, and there is no obesity. There is no detectable cardiovascular disease, no detectable diabetes. These people, by all measures, are far healthier than any population you could find in the United States or in any industrialized nation. They just do not suffer from the so-called diseases of civilization, which are the things that pop up when cultures become sedentary and affluent, and their diet changes and all that. And so, interestingly, on his study, during the course of the Catawba study, he actually did identify one person who was almost obese. He was kind of on the cusp of having obesity, with abdominal, a lot of abdominal fat. So he had a big belly. And this man also had the highest blood pressure of anyone, highest blood pressure, highest hip weight ratio of anyone on the island by far. Like, he was just an outlier. He's 50 pounds heavier than the average Catawban man of his height. And it turns out that he actually was not a permanent resident of Catawba. He was just visiting. He was a person, a Catawban who had left the island to go work as a businessman in Papua New Guinea. And so essentially what that shows is that it's not like the Catawbans are some kind of, genetic freaks that can eat whatever they want and stay lean. What it actually is that just like all other cultures, all other populations around the world, they're lean and healthy when they're eating a traditional diet. And then when they go to a modern industrialized diet, they develop bodies and they develop physiologies that are very similar to the ones that are prevalent in industrialized sedentary societies such as the United States. And so I thought that was a pretty striking illustration of that concept.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. And I mean, you talk about various statistics as well. And, in the 1960s, 1 out of 111 people being classified as very obese, whereas fast forward 50 years to 2010, and we're into 1 out of every 7 is very obese. And you touched on an interesting study in the 1970s, or effectively how we feed mice to really gain weight. Can you tell us a bit about the cafeteria diet and some of the insights that's led to?
Oh yeah, I think this is really interesting, and I think this is just a very basic fundamental observation that I keep coming back to because it's so important. So the more I've learned about rodent research, and just to clarify for the audience, my obesity research was primarily in rodents. We also did some human work, but primarily in rodents. And the more I've learned about rodents, the more I've actually come to believe that rats in particular are not as different from us as we would like to believe they are. There are a lot of really striking similarities in terms of how their brains are set up, how their brains are wired, how their brains communicate, and in terms of their physiology. And that doesn't necessarily mean all rodent research translates automatically to humans, but I think that in terms of just the basic functioning of the brain and how it interacts with food and things like that, I think there's actually a lot of similarities. So back in I believe it was the late 1960s, a guy named Anthony Sclafani was a graduate student, and he was trying to make rats obese. At the time, people, this was before the obesity epidemic, but there was still obesity around and people were trying to understand it. And they were trying to develop good rodent models for obesity. And so the most common thing to do was to add fat to the rat food, and then they would kind of slowly gain fat, and eventually some of them would become obese. But it was not a very rapid or efficient or effective strategy, and so they were looking for something better. So one day, Anthony Sclafani had this was back in the day where I think things were a little less regulated. Working with animals was a little kind of less scrutinized and regulated than it is today. But
sounds like it, yeah.
He had a rat. There was a rat that was on his lab bench, and it happened to come across a bowl of Fruit Loops that one of his fellow graduate students had put there. And rats are normally very wary of unfamiliar foods, and so they don't usually do anything but just kind of sniff or nibble something they've never seen before. But the rat went over to the Fruit Loops and just started completely stuffing its face. And yeah, and this is pretty unusual for a rat. And so this gave Sclafani this idea of, well, maybe I should just, if I want to make these rats fat, maybe I should just feed them human foods. Maybe I should just go out, get highly palatable, processed, calorie-dense human foods, and put a bunch of it in their cages and see what happens. And it turns out that this diet, which he originally called the supermarket diet, but later the more common name for it now is the cafeteria diet, they just absolutely gorge and become super obese. And there's no other diet that you can feed them, not a diet high in sugar, not a diet high in fat, not a diet high in sugar and fat. There's no other diet that you can give a normal rodent that will make it eat more or develop obesity more quickly than feeding it palatable, processed human food. So I think this is a pretty striking observation.